Welcome to the Real Estate Espresso Podcast, your morning shot of what's new in the world of real estate investing. I'm your host, Victor Menashe. Today's show is about Mr. Stephen Long. He's a construction worker who lives in Seattle, Washington. Mr. Long has been homeless since March of 2014 when he was evicted from his apartment after the rent got too high and he missed some payments. He said he'd previously lived out of a camper in the 1980s, traveling through 5 different states, so he thought he'd try sleeping in his truck. Mr. Long said it seemed safer than a shelter, where he feared his personal items could be stolen. And a truck is warmer than sleeping outside, he said. In the fall of 2016, when Mr. Long was doing cleanups for the city, he had parked his truck in the 900 block of Poplar Place near the Interstate 90 and Interstate 5 interchange. It was out of the way, according to Mr. Long's testimony. Mr. Long returned from his job after cleaning up CenturyLink Field when he discovered that his truck was gone. He'd been living in that 2000 vintage GMC pickup parked on a side street, but the city of Seattle towed it because Mr. Long had violated a city rule that requires vehicles to be moved every 72 hours. Mr. Long claimed he had told officers he was living in the truck. Nevertheless, Mr. Long tore off the impounding sticker and left the truck in its place. The parking officer waited at least 4 days before having the vehicle towed, giving Mr. Long extra time to buy the part needed to get it running. When the enforcement officer returned on October the 12th, the truck was still there, and Mr. Long was not, so the vehicle was towed. At the impound hearing, Mr. Long said the truck was his residence. The city waived a $44 ticket and reduced the towing and impounding fee from $900 to $557. But his attorneys said this still hurt Mr. Long in a number of ways. He had no home for a period of time, he'd lost income because his tools that he used for his daily work were in the truck, and he struggled to pay the fines because he only makes between $300 to $600 a month. Mr. Long sued the city of Seattle in municipal court back in May of 2017. He lost that case, so he filed an appeal, which Judge Schaefer heard in the spring of 2019. She ordered the city to refund Mr. Long the money he had paid so far. That impound set up an unusual court ruling that advocates for the homeless and the city both say could have broad implications for homelessness in the future. King County Superior Court Judge Catherine Schaefer ruled that the city's impoundment of Mr. Long's truck violated the state's Homestead Act, a frontier area law that protects properties from forced sale, because he was using it as a home. Mr. Long's vehicle was slated to be sold had he not entered into a monthly payment plan with the city. The judge also ruled that the fees the city required Mr. Long to pay were too high, violating constitutional protections against excessive fines. The decision could impact how cities across the state enforce parking regulations when people are living in cars. It speaks to the complications people living in vehicles pose for the city as it deals with a growing homelessness crisis. More than 2,300 people were living in their vehicles on the night of King County's 2017 homelessness count, representing about 20% of the county's homeless population. Police and parking enforcement officers could now find themselves in a bind if they can't definitively determine whether a vehicle is simply abandoned or if it's somebody's home. The city's legal team argued that the ruling makes the parking laws effectively invalid. By following the logic of Mr. Long's legal team, someone could park right in front of the courthouse and the city couldn't tow them. Or if they did tow them, they couldn't impound the vehicle. They'd have to put them somewhere else and couldn't charge them at all for it, because if they did, they'd violate the Constitution if the owner were living in the vehicle. The city has since appealed the case to the state level's appeals court, and the appeals court judges have been asked to decide the case on 2 main questions. Does fining someone living in their vehicle violate the United States Constitution 8th Amendment barring excessive fines and cruel and unusual punishments? And does attaching an impound fee to that vehicle, refusing to release the truck until Mr. Long entered into a payment plan, violate Washington State's Homestead Act? Now, if Mr. Long were right about the Homestead Act, he could pitch a tent in which he claimed his homestead in the middle of a field, and the city would be powerless to remove it. Mr. Long's lawyers argued that not only was Mr. Long forced by the seizure of his vehicle to sleep outside, but the fines amounted to the city punishing him for being homeless. They argued it is punitive to take away someone's home simply because of a parking violation. Mr. Long still lives in a truck, now with a trailer attached to it, but he lives outside of Seattle. He's working a full-time carpentry job in construction, and a ruling from the state appeals court is expected within the next 6 months. There's no question that despite being among the richest nations in the world, we in the West haven't figured out how to care for our homeless in our midst. and to help them get a roof over their head. As you think about that, have an awesome rest of your day. Go make some great things happen. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.